Hello everyone, peace be upon you. Before we begin, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe, and stay with me until the end of the story. Also, leave a comment telling me which city and country you're watching from. I'd love to see how far my story has reached. For those of you who have already subscribed, I sincerely wish you good health, ease in all your affairs, abundant blessings, and may all your hopes and dreams come true. Amen. Now, let's begin the story. Morning in Clearwater, Montana, came on like a quiet promise, thin light over the hills, a breath of cold cutting through pine, and the steady cough of old engines waking up on Main Street. Thompson Auto Service flicked on one bay at a time, fluorescent tubes humming to life above concrete stained with 20 years of stories. Kate Walker arrived before the clock, same as always, coffee in a metal tumbler and a habit for silence that made space for the day to reveal its problems on its own. She hung her jacket on the same hook, rolled her sleeves, and listened. Not to talk, not yet. You could tell a lot from the first sounds a vehicle made after a night of cooling, the lazy tick of a heat-shrunken exhaust, the uneven push of a tired fuel pump, the whisper of a belt one pull away from snapping. Kate didn't rush troubleshooting, she let the machine speak, and in the quiet she could separate the ordinary from the thing that didn't belong. George Thompson shuffled out from the office, paper ledger in hand, hat already tilted against imaginary glare. He nodded the way men do when a pattern holds. "Morning, Kate." That was enough. Ryan Mitchell swung a rolling toolbox into Bay 2, sleeves off, forearms nicked by a life spent fixing what other people broke. "We've got a '98 Silverado with a phantom stall," he said. Logan Brooks stacked oil filters like poker chips, eyes quick, mind quicker, always 2 questions ahead of what his hands were doing. Emily Saunders checked the day's tickets with a pencil she refused to trade for any tablet. If the numbers didn't line up, no wrench turned. Clearwater was a town that understood routine. Ranchers came before sunrise and teachers after 3. Tourists showed in the shoulder months, lost between park signs and cafe menus. Thompson Auto kept them all moving the way a good heart keeps blood in a body. Kate had become part of that pulse, not because she needed attention, but because she didn't. A dependable ghost in coveralls, grease under her nails that never really washed out. She worked the Silverado first. Fuel pressure steady. Idle wandering on heat soak. When Ryan asked, "Think it's the crank sensor," she only said, "Maybe," and tapped a finger along the harness where it chafed against an aftermarket bracket. The truck told on itself in a way only time could teach you to hear. She made the fix, buttoned it clean, and the V8 settled into a contented lope that pleased the owner more than any explanation would. Between jobs, Emily handed her a stack of parts slips. "We're tight on 5W30 and brake cleaner. Delivery says tomorrow." Kate nodded. "I'll stretch what we've got." She always did. She'd stretched everything for years: money, patience, distance from a past that woke her sometimes at 3 a.m. with the taste of dust and a radio crackle that didn't belong in Montana. When that happened, she'd sit on the stoop out back and watch the Dairy Queen sign blink slow, like a lighthouse for small-town problems. Then she'd go back to sleep and show up on time. At noon, George killed the overhead fans and said the magic word, "Diner." Ryan was already untying his apron. Logan volunteered to stay for a tire rotation. Emily snagged her blazer off a chair, clipped a pen to the pocket, and made a face at the weather. Clearwater Diner served pie that healed small disappointments and coffee that solved exactly one problem, needing something hot to hold while you talked around what actually hurt. Kate liked a booth against the wall where she could see the door without thinking about it. A habit she never explained. They ate fast, talked about a high school game and a road closure up by the ridge. When the windows rattled, just a little, Kate glanced up on instinct. A cattle truck grumbled by and the glass settled. Nothing. She let her shoulders drop and finished her sandwich. Back at the shop, the afternoon stacked its work without drama. A brake job that fought back, a battery swap, a check engine light that turned out to be nothing more than a gas cap and a driver who needed reassurance more than a part. It was the sort of day that proved a life could be rebuilt out of small, correct actions. Kate liked the order, torque specs, fluid capacities, the feel of a fastener tightening to precisely where it should land. There was comfort in numbers that didn't lie and metal that behaved if you treated it right. People were trickier. People remembered, even when they pretended not to. She kept her head low, her skill set to normal, and her stories sealed under a layer of routine thick enough to pass for peace. Evening slid in early, autumn doing its slow work on the sky. Emily closed the register. Logan locked the side door. Ryan wiped down the big jack, humming something from the radio. George counted the drawer twice, the way men who've lost before make sure the world can't surprise them again. Kate rolled her toolbox to its corner, latched each drawer, and paused. The town sounded right, faraway dogs, one last motorcycle taking the straight out of town too fast, a train horn soft as a memory. Then the air changed. Not in volume at first, but in weight. A low mechanical growl reached them from somewhere past the traffic light, deeper than a semi, heavier than farm equipment, a note that didn't belong on Main Street. Ryan looked up. Logan held his breath without realizing. Emily's pen froze mid-tally. Kate didn't move. She didn't need to. She knew the pitch of that sound and the way it lived in your ribs. She'd heard it years ago in places this town would never name out loud. She set her tumbler down and listened the way you listen to news you can't stop from coming. The growl grew, patient and certain, rolling over the asphalt like weather. In Clearwater, most machines asked for help. This one asked for an answer. She already felt the day bending when the vehicle turned the corner and the sound became a presence. Headlights came first, then armor, then the bulk of a desert tan JLTV filling Main Street like a bad memory that found a new address. It rolled to a stop in front of Thompson Auto with the deliberate weight of something built to ignore problems most towns never see. The shop lights caught on angular panels and dust like sun on bone. The idol wasn't clean, there was a harmonic under it, a thin off-key note that didn't care about small-town manners. George stepped out onto the apron, half a greeting ready, half of him already doing math about liability and contracts. Ryan wiped his hands on a rag that wasn't going to help and muttered, "That's not a cattle hauler." Logan stood still like a rabbit deciding if the hawk had seen him. Emily closed the register with one finger still between the pages, as if a number could hold the moment in place. 3 men spilled out of the JLTV with economy and calm, Commander Jack Reynolds first, posture straight as a rule you don't argue, Chief Warrant Officer Tyler Hayes behind him, gear squared, eyes doing their slow sweep, Petty Officer Eric Collins last, younger, watchful, carrying that mix of pride and suspicion that lives in people sent to find answers. Reynolds took in the sign, the bays, the faces, then somewhere behind all that, the woman in coveralls who hadn't moved. "Need a mechanic," he said. It wasn't a question. George gestured at the shop and found his voice. "We close in 10. The commander didn't look at the clock. "This won't take 10. Hayes popped the hood with practiced hands. The smell hit quick, hot lubricant with the metallic tang of something chewing itself fine. Collins watched Kate the way a young man watches a quiet room, waiting for the one person who actually knows what's going on to speak and refusing to be the first to ask. Kate stepped closer, not touching yet. The idle tremor crawled from the grill into her bones. Familiar. Wrong. Whose lead? Reynolds asked, eyes on George but attention already sliding back toward Kate. George opened his mouth, closed it, then pointed. Kate didn't nod. She just reached for the diagnostic cable she kept locked in a drawer nobody bothered with. It wasn't standard shop gear. She had told herself 100 times she kept it for curiosity. Curiosity had a habit of sounding like duty when certain engines coughed. She clipped in and watched data bloom into graphs that would look like static to most people. To her, it was a conversation. Temperatures off by a margin that only mattered when miles stacked hot and unforgiving. Vibration signatures ghosting through the drivetrain. Particle counts in fluid streams that didn't lie. She listened with her hands too, the faint buzz on the housing, the pulse up through the frame, the soft complaint of a synchronizer that had been given the wrong kind of help. "Who's been servicing it?" she asked. Hayes answered, "Because men like him don't dodge facts." "Base contractor." Kate nodded once. "They used the wrong spec fluid. Civilian blend. It's shaving your synchronizers and pushing harmonics into the differential. You've got hairline stress starting here." She tapped the case with 2 fingers, gentle as if waking a friend. "Put weight and heat on it, it'll propagate. Eat your mission from under you." Collins let a breath out he didn't know he was holding. Reynolds did not move. "You can fix it," he said. The words were flat, but behind them was the calculus of timetables and people who depended on machines doing as asked. Kate looked at George, not for permission, just to make sure he saw the fork in the road they were about to take. He gave the smallest nod a man can give and still call it consent. She laid out tools that didn't belong in a shop this size, instruments collected over years of pretending she was only what Clearwater needed her to be. Ryan stared. Logan forgot to blink. Emily steadied herself with the clipboard like it could keep a person from falling into a past they thought they outran. Kate drained fluids, pulled covers, read metal like scripture. She flushed the lines, cleaned what could be saved, replaced what couldn't, and recalibrated the system to a standard nobody in that room had named out loud yet everyone could feel. While she worked, Clearwater noticed. People slow-walked past the window with their takeout bags and small-town bravery. A JLTV parked under the Thompson sign made even quiet lives curious. The diner's bell rang across the street like an echo to an older field bell in a place with no street names. Kate kept her head in the job. Heat bled out of the housing, then steadied. The ugly hum softened, then smoothed until the idle was just a low, trained heart. Reynolds stepped closer, hands behind his back, boots set the way boots do when they've learned not to shift without reason. "How did you know?" He didn't finish the sentence because he didn't want to say the rest of it in front of his men in this town. "How did you know like that?" Kate wiped a streak of oil off her wrist and said, "Experience." It wasn't untrue. It also wasn't the whole truth. Hayes glanced at the scatter of shavings in the tray and gave a short nod that meant respect more than agreement. Collins looked from the tray to Kate to the readouts, connecting dots that he would later pretend weren't so easy to connect. George looked older and strangely lighter at the same time, as if a question he'd never dared ask finally had a shape. The test run was short. Kate took the JLTV to the end of Main and back, listening for the ghost in the gears. It didn't follow them home. She parked square, killed the engine, and the shop exhaled. Clearwater's night sounds came back in, dog, train, the distant highway, and for a heartbeat the day pretended to be normal again. Reynolds offered a thank you that sounded like a report. Hayes gave her a look that said he had a dozen questions he wouldn't ask here. Collins hesitated, then said, "Appreciate it, ma'am," like he was trying the word on to see if it fit the person he was looking at. The 3 of them loaded up with the same efficiency they arrived with. The JLTV rolled away, this time carrying itself clean. The street felt wider without it, but the air didn't reset. Something had been said in a language only a few people spoke. Ryan finally found his voice. "So, crank sensor." Kate almost smiled. "Not today." She locked her toolbox. Emily shut off the office light. Logan stood at the window long after the taillights were gone, like he could still hear the note that changed everything. George turned the deadbolt and rested his hand on the door a second longer than habit. "Go home," he said, but he was talking to the old day, not the people. Outside, Clearwater settled into its ordinary night, but ordinary had a hairline in it now, a line that would travel under heat and load if you didn't deal with it in time. They didn't know yet that the knock would come early, that black plates would nose into the lot before the fan spun up, that the questions wouldn't be about parts or invoices. Kate did. She felt it the way you feel weather in your bones. She walked to her truck, paused, and looked back at the sign. Tomorrow was already moving toward them, and it arrived before sunrise, wrapped in government plates and the kind of quiet that makes neighbors look through curtains. The lot lights were still buzzing to full when a black SUV rolled in and settled like it planned to stay. Kate had the bay doors half open, breath ghosting in the cold, coffee steaming in her hand. She recognized the tempo without needing the badges. Questions first, paperwork second, answers last. Agent Lauren Parker stepped out with a folder tucked under her arm and the steady calm of someone used to standing in rooms people would rather keep private. Daniel Hughes followed, taller, carrying a tablet like it knew more than anyone here wanted it to. Parker's glance took the whole place in, cataloging exits, faces, the distance from the office to the bays. Hughes marked the sign, the toolboards, the spotless corners that didn't fit the myth of a sleepy shop. They moved together but left enough space for Control to breathe. George came from the office, tie not quite straight, jaw set in the line men get when they're about to be told their life is a misunderstanding. Ryan stalled halfway to a tire rack and decided to look useful. Logan clutched a box of filters like it was paperwork that might save him. Emily's hand hovered over the phone, not to call anyone, just to anchor herself to the normal. Parker introduced, credentials flashing like a hinge on a heavy door. She said NCIS and follow-up on a Department of the Navy asset serviced on these premises, and clarification, a word that always means the opposite of what people hope. Kate didn't flinch. She set her cup down on the workbench and folded the shop into the shape it needed to be, honest, cooperative, unafraid. They asked about the JLTV, about procedures, about tools that didn't look like something you buy from a catalog that ships in 2 days. They asked how long she'd been here, what certifications she held, what service history explained the certainty in her hands. Kate answered in the straight lines a small-town trusts. Routine, ASE, years. She used the word experience like a rag that can wipe almost any surface clean if you push hard enough. Parker listened to the gaps as much as the words. Hughes watched the screens she didn't turn on. The day dragged a net over the shop. Customers came, took one look, and found ways to come back tomorrow. The diner sent a tray of coffee across the street because that's what you do when federal agents stand where regulars usually joke about carburetors. The train horn at mid-morning sounded farther away than usual. Kate kept breathing in equal measure, the way she had learned to in places that made air feel optional. When the helicopter came, it didn't announce itself so much as assert the obvious, this wasn't just a check-in. Rotor wash bullied the prairie grass behind the shop and pushed dust into corners that hadn't seen it in years. General William Harrington stepped onto Montana dirt with the posture of a man who carries consequences like other men carry keys. With him, Colonel Maggie Turner wore the truth like a fit uniform, and Director Olivia Bennett brought the polished weight of Washington in a navy suit that looked like it had never met weather. George's shoulders sank a fraction before he squared them again. Ryan's jaw tightened. Logan forgot to swallow. Emily did the math on the day and realized the total would not balance. Parker's expression didn't change, but the room turned toward Harrington the way metal turns toward a magnet. Authority makes its own weather. They asked for privacy and then defined it as, everyone who doesn't need to know, out. Kate remained. George stayed because there are lines you don't cross without the man whose name is on the sign. The others drifted to the far bay, a polite exile that still heard every third word. Harrington didn't waste syllables. He laid out a service record that the room did not possess, not as accusation, as context. Years compressed into sentences, deployments turned into coordinates, projects into titles that said nothing and meant everything. Turner added details only someone who had held a flashlight at midnight under a humming frame would know. Bennett spoke the language of risk and mitigation, of assets and exposure, of lives that get bent when secrets leak. Parker slid in just enough doubt to test the story for leaks. Hughes brought up a file that didn't exist yesterday but held photographs that did. Kate at the bay, cable clipped, eyes on data she had no business reading if the world were simple. It rarely is. They circled the same truth from different angles until the concrete floor felt like a map. Kate kept her feet planted where she could see the door and the people between her and it. She did not explain the desert dust she still tasted some nights, or the bolt pattern that went wrong a lifetime ago, or the way a convoy's silence feels when metal fails. She did not say the word sabotage. She did not need to. The way Turner's eyes hardened said it for her. The conversation shifted from who to what now. Bennett outlined paths like lanes on a highway that all led away from the person Clearwater thought it knew: reactivation, consultancy, protective measures that would redraw the boundaries of a small life into rings of clearance and classified calendars. Harrington made an offer sound less like a demand by telling the truth: expertise doesn't evaporate, it either serves or it leaks. Turner couched duty as choice without softening what choice costs. George looked at Kate the way a father looks at a daughter who isn't his but might as well be: pride, fear, acceptance. Ryan stared at the floor until his eyes watered, then blinked it back and found a way to stand taller. Logan tried to imagine the version of the world where a mechanic in Clearwater could fix a problem the Navy couldn't. Emily wrote the words "inventory" on a blank pad because hands need work when the mind has too much. Kate said very little. Not because she didn't have words, but because the ones that mattered needed to be saved for when saying them would move something besides air. She asked one question: are there people at risk right now because of this? Harrington didn't hesitate. There are always people at risk. The question is whether that risk is increased or reduced by what you decide. The shop settled into a quiet that didn't belong to Montana, and the clock above the door ticked like it had been given extra responsibilities. Outside, Clearwater went about its chores pretending this was just another federal visit about a zoning issue or a grant. Inside, the floor held the weight of a life being measured. Lunch came and went in a blur of coffee that went cold and sandwiches nobody finished. The helicopter cooled. The SUV waited. The wind leaned on the bay door and the open edges of everyone's plans. Bennett laid down a sheet of paper that might as well have been a choose-your-own ending. Turner placed a coin on it, a habit from briefings past, to keep it from sliding in the draft. Harrington remained still enough that the room adjusted around him. Kate finally nodded, not to surrender, to accept gravity. "We do this here," she said. 4 words that rearranged a town. Parker's eyebrows climbed a millimeter and stopped. Hughes typed faster. Bennett considered and recalculated. Turner almost smiled. Harrington breathed out slow, a small private truce with a memory. They began drawing new lines, access protocols that would wrap Thompson Auto without suffocating it, schedules that would bring students through Clearwater without turning it into a base, quiet guards that would look like customers and only feel like shadows if you knew how to feel for them. George asked about insurance. Emily asked about purchase orders. Ryan asked if they were still fixing Mrs. Hargrove's Camry at 3. Logan asked nothing because he was memorizing. When the signatures were inked, pens heavy, strokes deliberate, the room didn't cheer. The air lightened by a degree you could only feel if you'd been holding it too long. Harrington shook George's hand like he was shaking a bridge to test it. Turner touched 2 fingers to the edge of Kate's workbench, a private salute to the altar where she'd chosen to stand. Bennett gave Parker a look that meant the paperwork would catch up to the facts. Hughes took a photo of the sign with a government phone that would never admit to its own gallery. They left as neatly as they arrived, rotor wash lifting dust and a few loose papers that skittered under a tire rack until Logan bent to catch them. The lot fell back into Montana stillness. The clock remembered how to just be a clock. The diner bell rang across the street, stubborn in its ordinary. Kate stood in Bay 3, hands idle for the first time all day, and listened to the building breathe. Routine would return with a new seam stitched through its middle. Clearwater would keep moving. The work would go on. But the line under heat and load had been addressed, and that mattered. Night would come, and with it calls, emails, a list of changes Emily would turn into columns. But for a moment, the shop was simply itself again: concrete, steel, oil, and people who made broken things stop being broken. Kate reached for her tumbler, took a sip of coffee gone cold, and didn't mind. Outside, the wind shifted. Inside, the The decision had already begun to turn into work, and work did what it always does when the stakes climb. It demanded hands, focus, and the kind of calm you can't fake. The afternoon slid toward a sky the color of old steel. Wind pressed against the bay doors like a stranger testing a lock. Clearwater kept humming outside, but inside Thompson Auto the air tightened. Emily spread fresh forms like a field map. Ryan staged jacks, stands, welders as if lining up chess pieces. Logan cleared Bay 3 until the concrete looked like a runway. They heard the engine before they saw the vehicle. Different note this time, urgent, ragged, a machine that had missed too many chances to be heard. The Desert 10 JLTV shouldered into the lot with a limp in its driveline you could feel through the floor. Reynolds slid out before the wheels stopped rolling, headset around his neck, eyes hard set on the space where Kate already stood. Hayes came next, gear squared, scanning for what he could control. Collins looked older by a month he hadn't lived yet. No introductions, no preamble. Mission wasn't a word, it was the weather. The hood came up. Heat hit like a furnace door. The smell was wrong, burnt additive and the bitter edge of metal surrendering in particles too fine to see with the naked eye. Kate didn't reach first, she listened. The idol staggered, stabilized, staggered again, a tired heart trying to sprint. The display told the same story in numbers, asymmetry across axles, temp delta marching up, pressure maps whispering about a failure line nobody else had drawn yet. Parker and Hughes arrived without sirens, moving fast without looking like they were. Bennett stepped in with a folder that didn't bend and eyes that didn't blink at wind. Turner entered last, shoulders square to whatever history waited. Harrington took the room by simply being in it. The truth came out in clean lines because dirty ones would only slow them down. The wrong spec fluid hadn't been an accident. A supplier 2 states away had shipped a lot, within tolerance, that wasn't, and the paper trail wore the fingerprints of people who didn't care where American machines died as long as they died on time. The bolt patterns from years back, the memory that hooked Kate's ribs every time a train sounded, weren't a one-off translation error in an honest factory, they were part of a pattern. Not rumor. Not guess. Turner's voice held the weight of proof. Bennett's folder held the kind of signatures that end contracts and start prosecutions. Harrington didn't say I'm sorry or you were right. He said, we're here now, which is the only apology the job ever gives. Choice presented itself, not as a speech but as hardware, fix this under heat and eyes and a clock that bites, or watch the risk cascade outward to people whose names none of them would ever know. Kate rolled her shoulders once, the way athletes do before a final rep, and answered without ceremony. She set the shop's center of gravity and everyone fell into orbit. Ryan handled disassembly with that steady speed that wins more fights than flair. Logan pulled diagnostic feeds, cross-checked with a fluency he didn't have last week but had now because pressure teaches. Emily called the parts supplier within driving distance and then called again when the answer wasn't good enough the first time. George opened a drawer in the office that hadn't been opened in years and removed a laminated list of favors he could still call in Montana. Parker arranged a perimeter disguised as courtesy. Hughes mirrored it with procedures no one would notice until they needed them. Bennett stood where the government stands when it decides to help without getting in the way. Turner adjusted torque settings like a memory muscle she didn't know she still had. Harrington watched the far horizon of responsibility and let the people who knew this end of the work own it. Kate drained what had to go, the fluid ran out with a glitter that would be pretty if it wasn't a eulogy. She caught shavings on a magnet, read them, and adjusted the plan by a degree that meant the difference between for now and for good. The welder came alive. Heat pooled bright and mean. She stitched a line along the housing where stress had already started to whisper about tomorrow's failure. The bead laid down clean. She let it cool slow, forced patience into the metal the way a hand steadies a bucking heart. The wind threw a shoulder at the bay doors and the lights flickered like a bad omen. George barked for the generator before the building could make up its mind. Ryan had it turning in seconds. The welder never hiccuped. Emily delivered numbers without drama, ETA on fluids, ETA on seals, ETA on the courier who owed George a favor from 1999. Logan called out temps and pressure like a metronome with instincts. Collins fetched, carried, held, watched, the respect in his silence louder than any thank you. Hayes enforced a bubble of enough space around the work for art to happen, because for all the talk of specs and standards, saving a machine under a clock is art. Reynolds did what real leaders do in the worst moments, he became gravity, keeping everyone from flying apart. Mid-job, the memory hit Kate like a low wave, dust boiling across a runway that didn't have a name on maps, a convoy waiting for a nod, a younger version of her signing off on a spec sheet that betrayed her without blinking. The smell of hot metal turned into the smell of a night that never left. She didn't freeze. She let it pass through the way wind passes through grass when the roots are deep. She had new information now. She forgave exactly nothing, including herself, and kept moving. Parts arrived with the relief of rain. Emily checked lot numbers twice. Kate checked once and still sent Logan for the handheld scope because trust lives longer when it's verified. Install, torque, recalibrate. She told the system who it was supposed to be, and, slowly, it remembered. The idle smoothed to something a person could love. The vibration signature settled into a band that promised duty instead of drama. Temps came down like a fever breaking. They didn't shut the hood yet. Test time earned honesty. Reynolds drove, Hayes rode, Kate sat front right, headset on, eyes on readouts that used to be behind fences and now lived, for this minute, in a Montana streetlight. They took Maine to the edge of town and pointed at the ridge where the wind lives. They pushed load, then coasted, then pushed again, listening for the ghost that had haunted them all day. It didn't show. The curve by the old grain elevator would have pulled a flaw out like a splinter. Silence. The climb past the cattle guard would have stressed a weak weld into confession. Nothing. At the turnaround, Kate put her palm flat against the housing and felt only the kind of heat that means a job is being done and paid for. Back at the shop, she signed a line on a clipboard Emily had turned into a small, local ceremony. It wasn't pageantry. It was a marker, this is where we did the thing we said we would do. Harrington nodded, one soldier to another without saying it. Turner's eyes softened for the first time that day. Bennett closed her folder like a door properly latched. Parker accepted that sometimes the best answer to a question is a running engine. Hughes captured data that would live in places Kate didn't need to think about anymore. The JLTV idled in the lot, steady as a drumline. Reynolds stood with Kate in the wash of its lights and said almost nothing, which fit the size of the moment better than thanks ever could. Hayes gave a short, certain look. Collins exhaled like he'd been sprinting in place and was finally allowed to stop. Then the second choice arrived dressed as an offer but built like a turning. Harrington laid out reactivation terms without threat. Turner described a role that wasn't a return so much as a redemption arc engineered into a job description. Bennett detailed a wrap of protection that would let Clearwater sleep even as its address changed on maps that don't fold. Parker and Hughes took custody of the sabotage thread and promised, in their way, to pull it until the right sweaters unraveled. Kate looked at George. He didn't blink. "We can build it," he said, voice low, like a man deciding to pour a foundation before the weather turns. Ryan squared his shoulders like he was already wearing an instructor badge he hadn't earned yet. Logan gripped the back of a chair the way you grip the rail of a ship that's leaving harbor. Emily drew a box on her page and wrote, in neat block letters, "Start tomorrow." Kate felt the old guilt rise like smoke and then thin out in a draft she hadn't had until this exact second. She thought of the bolt pattern that wasn't a mistake, of the years she had punished herself for other people's intentions, of the quiet mornings in Clearwater when machines confessed and she translated. She thought of the lives downstream from this bay, from this choice. She nodded once, the same way she had nodded before she picked up the welder. "We do it here," she said again, and this time the words weren't a proposal, they were a plan. The wind slowed. The generator clicked off. The shop returned to the sound of itself. Outside, Main Street took a breath it didn't know it had been holding. Inside, Kate walked to her toolbox, set her hand on the top drawer, and felt, finally, the click of a lock sliding into the right place, and the next morning proved it wasn't a feeling but a plan taking shape. Clearwater woke to a different rhythm, same mountains, same diner bell, but a new purpose threaded through the air like fresh wiring. Thompson Auto opened on time, only now the bays were measured, labeled, and mapped into modules. Signs hung clean and simple: intake, diagnostics, drivetrain, heat treat, QA. Emily had laid them out with a pencil and a square, then ordered the real ones overnight. If you looked close, you could still see the pencil ghosts, the first lines of a new shape. Ryan arrived early with a checklist and a kind of quiet pride that doesn't need applause. He walked the floor like a range officer, touching each jack, each stand, each torque wrench set to spec. Logan followed with a tablet and a paper notebook because he had learned not to trust any single memory device. He logged temps, voltages, harmonics baselines, then wrote them again by hand until the numbers lived in his muscle. George unlocked the office and opened the big ledger the town knew, then slid it aside and lifted out a thin binder marked Program, Phase 1. He didn't sigh. He adjusted his glasses and started making calls. By mid-morning, 2 pickups and a black SUV sat curbside in a way that wouldn't spook a small town. Reynolds walked in with his posture dialed down to neighborly, but the edges were still there. Hayes carried cases that looked like contractor boxes if you didn't look too hard. Collins shook hands with George like they were just talking about tires. They brought the first group, operators who could strip and rebuild a weapon blindfolded but had never been asked to listen to a gearbox like it had something to say. Kate gave them the rule that mattered most: we don't rush truth. We make space for it. It wasn't a motto on the wall. It was how the work would save someone miles away. Parker and Hughes showed up with paperwork that would tuck the program under the right umbrellas without turning it into a spectacle. They didn't hover. They confirmed standards, drew circles around sensitive corners, and stepped back. Bennett called from D.C. and said the words Kate needed to hear: funds cleared. Deliverables protected. The sabotage investigation was moving, quiet, targeted, names being matched to orders, lots being traced to signatures that thought they could hide in loopholes. Turner's message came through short and clean: training lanes approved. Field rotation schedule incoming. Harrington didn't call. He sent a one-line email that read, "Good start. Continue." The first module wasn't flashy. Kate opened a JLTV driveline on a rolling stand and showed them how metal tells you a story if you let it. She put a magnet under a drain and waited. She showed them the shimmer that means wear before failure, the faint ring in a case that means stress is talking in a frequency most people never learn to hear. She taught them to feel with a palm flat against a housing, to read temperature spreads as sentence structure, to catch a lie a sensor will tell when a lazy tech tries to mask a deeper fault. Ryan ran the heat cycle and the weld bench, steady and exact. Emily ran logistics like air traffic, lining part numbers and suppliers on pathways that kept everything flowing without waves. Logan kept time, data, and mood, calling out numbers, then posting the trend on the board, then catching a tired mind before it made a snap choice that would cost 2 hours. Word got around town without anyone meaning to spread it. The diner poured coffee for men and women who wore plain clothes but stood like they were used to checking corners. The Pinewood Lodge booked out a few rooms under names nobody repeated. Clearwater didn't change its shape. It absorbed. The kids still biked past the shop at 4, the church still rang on Sunday, the feed store still closed at 6. Only now, if you stood behind the glass at Thompson and watched, you'd see something like a small factory for second chances. The second week brought the first real test. A training JLTV arrived with a vibration no one could pin down, nothing obvious, just a nagging ghost above a certain load. The shop slid into its new gear without needing to be asked. Baseline, confirm, isolate. They flushed, scoped, pulled a section of harness that had rubbed under heat cycles until the copper sang a wrong note. Kate found the exact edge where the jacket had slicked thin and turned diagnosis into a lesson on humility. Machines don't care how good you are. They care how patient you are. The fix held. The students learned. More importantly, they learned how to teach themselves next time. By the end of the month, Clearwater had a rhythm for the traffic that would have felt like a parade in any other town. People stopped staring. They waved. The diner put a turkey melt on the board with a joke name no one repeated on official forms. George negotiated a bulk deal on fluids with a distributor in Billings who didn't ask questions, only demanded answers about quality. Emily redesigned inventory so that nothing that mattered could run out without 3 alarms going off, one of them being her own sense that the room felt wrong. Ryan started a wall of field hacks that became doctrine, each card a tip that would shave a minute off in heat and pressure. Logan taped a gum wrapper to one because the fix it recorded had been born out of nothing more glamorous than preventing a rattle that masked a bigger sound. There were hiccups. A shipment got routed to the wrong town with the right name 2 states away. Emily solved it in 6 calls and 1, "I know where you live," in a voice that made the dispatcher laugh and then get serious. A rumor drifted that Thompson had become a federal base. George invited the mayor to watch a class from the doorway, no cameras, just eyes. The mayor left with a new respect for torque specs and the sense that his town had managed to matter without losing itself. One night the wind came hard and knocked out a strip of lights. Logan and Ryan swapped in spares by headlamp while Kate finished a bead she refused to leave half done. The power came back. So did clarity. On a clear afternoon, Reynolds returned with a quiet after-action story from a training lane that could have gone sideways. A loom fix taught in Bay 3 had been the difference between a planned stop and an unplanned tow in country where you don't want to linger. He didn't hand out medals. He said, "It held," and that was more than enough. Hayes stood a few yards off with his arms crossed, letting the silence underline what his words would have overdrawn. Collins helped Logan reorganize a drawer like they'd been sharing a bench for years. The sabotage thread kept unwinding somewhere far from Main Street. Parker stopped by less often, but when she did, it was to say concrete things: indictments drafted, contracts frozen, a plant closed for inspection with a date stamp that meant yes, this time we mean it. Hughes sent summaries that read like clean code: inputs, outputs, no romance. Bennett approved equipment upgrades that replaced Kate's old lock drawer gear with official versions, serialed and tracked, but no less sharp. Turner forwarded a note from a school where a lecture based on Kate's module had been met with that rare classroom silence that means the point landed where it needed to. Clearwater noticed other, smaller shifts. George stopped counting the drawer 3 times. Twice was plenty. Emily took 20 minutes at lunch without looking at the clock like it might punish her. Ryan slept better because his hands were tired for the right reasons. Logan's mother stopped asking when he was going to get a real job and started dropping off cookies once a week without commentary. Kate cut her coffee with water after noon and found she didn't wake up quite so often at 3. Recognition came in forms nobody had chased. A regional logistics chief sent a letter on heavy paper, thanking the shop for excellence rendered in plain sight. A base commander mailed a patch with a note that said, "For the board, if you want it." Harrington's second email was 2 lines, "Good work. Expand." Turner sent a single photograph, a young tech in a far-off hangar, palm flat on a housing, eyes closed, listening. No caption. None needed. Some evenings, when the wind died and the sky took its time burning out behind the ridge, Kate would stand on the apron and let the day settle. She'd listen for the freight train that cut through town like a low memory. It still pulled something in her chest, but the ache had changed shape. Where guilt used to live like grit in a joint, there was a smoother motion, a hinge that had been cleaned and greased and put back to work. She didn't rewrite the past. She rethreaded it into now. On one of those evenings, the town council voted to let a small sign go up under Thompson Auto Service, advanced vehicle training, by appointment only, and nobody made a speech about it. The mayor just nodded and said, "We keep this quiet, we keep this good." People clapped like they do after a hymn. The program's first class rotated out. Before they left, they signed the back of a steel panel Ryan had salvaged from a wreck, each name small, each date a marker. Collins wrote his initials, then drew a tiny dot next to them. Logan asked. Collins said, "That's the moment something didn't break." Ryan bolted the panel to the wall above the whiteboard where Emily kept the calendar. It caught the shop lights just enough to remind them of what they were making. When the new group rolled in, Kate didn't make a speech. She set a drain pan, placed a magnet, and said, "We're going to listen." The room fell into the kind of quiet that isn't empty but expectant. Outside, Main Street went on being Main Street. Inside, the work continued to turn. And with each rotation, each measured torque, each clean thread, each recalibrated tolerance, the town, the team, and the people passing through learned how to carry weight without being crushed by it. Clearwater didn't become a headline. It became a promise kept, one small corrected action at a time. And in Bay 3, where the day had once bent towards something dark, the lights burned steady, the tools found their homes, and the engines leaving the apron took their breath smooth and even into the long road ahead, the way a town inhales when it finally believes tomorrow might actually show up on time. Clearwater learned the rhythm fast, mornings broke over the ridge, the diner bell marked first coffee, and Thompson Auto carried a heartbeat you could set your watch to. The sign under the sign, Advanced Vehicle Training, didn't shout. It just sat there, modest and exact, like a torque spec printed small in the corner of a page. People noticed without making a fuss. That was the deal. Classes rotated in, rotated out. The steel panel on the wall gathered names in careful rows, each a small warranty against giving up. Ryan added a narrow shelf beneath it and lined up odd little artifacts that meant nothing to anyone who'd never worked under a clock, a scored bearing that taught patience, a miscrimped terminal that taught humility, a spotless filter that taught the difference between clean and clean enough. Logan started a ledger of field notes, simple, clear, no poetry, just what worked and why, and taped a gum wrapper to the front because sometimes the quietest fix saves the loudest day. Emily turned requisitions into pathways so reliable that parts arrived before a panic had time to form. George learned to sleep again. What came back from the outside was never dramatic. That was the point. Reynolds would stop by in plain clothes, stand with a shoulder against the bay door, and deliver a 2-sentence update that weighed more than a medal, the loom held on the pass. We didn't have to stop. Hayes sent a photo once, no faces, just a tire track at dawn where a vehicle had kept moving when the ground wanted it to quit. Collins called late one night and said, "I heard the note in time," then hung up before gratitude could make the moment sentimental. Parker returned with the kind of news that rewires trust. Charges filed. Contracts barred. A factory floor taped off with a seriousness that felt like justice, not theater. Hughes showed data curves flattening where they used to spike, proof, in clean lines, that less was breaking in places that never make the news. Bennett visited twice, the first time to walk the bays in silence and ask 3 questions that mattered, the second to hand George a folder with funding for lights that didn't flicker and welders that didn't need coaxing. Turner sent a whole pallet of training housings with a note scrawled in the margin, "Wear these out teaching. Make better mistakes next cycle." Harrington arrived only once, stepping in from the wind like a man checking a bridge he ordered built, and left with a handshake for each of them, no speech, just the sentence that fit, "Carry on." Recognition followed at the tempo Kate could live with. A letter on thick paper, an invitation to a stage with flags, words like distinguished and outstanding threaded into sentences that tried very hard not to feel like a replacement for what can't be repaid. She wore the dress uniform because the occasion asked her to, she stood straight because the people watching had earned that much. When the applause hit, she looked out and found what she needed to anchor the moment, George at the end of an aisle gripping his hat in both hands, Emily counting breaths so she wouldn't cry on principle, Ryan steady as a jack stand, Logan fidgeting like a man sitting on a socket he forgot was in his back pocket. After, a young tech from a base she would never see again asked for a photo and said, "I didn't know you were allowed to listen to a machine that way." Kate told him, "You're allowed. You're responsible." Back home, the town did the town's version of ceremony. The council approved a small plaque for the wall near the office, words sandblasted neat, service rendered, lives downstream. The diner named a sandwich for the program and then changed it back when Kate asked them to, because this wasn't a theme. The high school shop class visited on a Thursday. Logan set a bucket by the door and wrote in chalk above it, "Questions go here." It filled. He stayed late answering them, careful with the part where curiosity becomes vocation. Some changes were quieter. The 3 a.m. wake-up still came, just less like alarms and more like reminders. When they did, Kate would pull on a sweatshirt, pad to the kitchen, and set her palm on the cool tin of the sugar canister like she was checking a housing. Breathe in, breathe out. The radio crackle in her head softened from command tone to Coast Guard weather, useful, not urgent. On certain mornings she drove to the edge of town, parked where the gravel gives way to grass, and watched the freight train ease through the cut, the horn low and familiar. It still tugged at the knot that tied then to now, but the knot wasn't choking anymore. It was holding. The program grew only as fast as it could stay honest. Emily swatted away anything shiny that didn't fit the work. "We don't scale mistakes," she'd say, pencil tapping a pad. Ryan mentored without announcing it, trading tricks for questions, refusing to let shortcuts masquerade as experience. Logan learned when to talk and when to let the room hear itself think. George became the kind of administrator who knows when a signature is a promise he'll actually have to keep. On a windless afternoon, a delivery truck brought a crate stamped with the sort of codes that don't belong on a small-town loading dock. Inside, a new diagnostic rig with a letter clipped under its handle. "Turner again, for the next cohort. Teach them why, not just how." Kate ran a palm across the top plate, felt the mill marks under the paint, and thought about tools she'd locked away for 2 decades. She set the rig in the corner of Bay 3, where the light fell clean across it, and told the class, "Don't worship it. Use it." Neighbors kept being neighbors. The church asked for help tuning the generator before winter. Ryan drew a map of the wiring from memory and Logan traced it with a meter until the hums settled right. The feed store needed a forklift to behave better at low speed and cold. Emily worked the phones until the right viscosity oil showed up with a handshake price. Thompson Auto fixed the usual things with the unusual care they used on machines that held other people's chances. The town never turned into a base. It stayed a town. The sabotage cases wound their way through courts and committees where patience is a test and paperwork is a weapon. Parker didn't report every beat. She reported the ones that meant something, a plea that admitted what everyone had known in their bones, a sentencing that set a bar higher than the minimum, a compliance standard rewritten by people who'd been standing in Bay 3 long enough to understand why numbers on a page need to match heat in a hand. Hughes sent a chart with 3 lines, failures, near fails, and caught before it mattered, one falling faster, one rising in the steady way progress does when nobody is cheering. On a cold, bright morning, the class gathered around a training driveline for a final pass. Kate watched them work with the kind of pride that doesn't inflate, just settles, the way a well-seated bearing does. Reynolds slipped in, listened for a minute, and left a patch on the bench without a word. Hayes stood under the shop clock, arms folded, looking satisfied in a way he'd never call that. Collins leaned on a post and told Logan a story about a noise he'd have missed last year. When the students signed the steel panel, one of them traced a tiny dot next to his initials. Logan smiled and said, "I know what that means." The town marked the end of the cohort with coffee in paper cups and a tray of cookies that went too fast. No speeches. George cleared his throat, muttered something about being proud, and waved a hand like he was shooing flies. Emily took a picture no one posed for and printed 1 copy for the corkboard. Ryan cleaned the bead on a small weld that didn't need cleaning and called it therapy. Kate stood in the doorway, looking at the road where the next group would come from and the last group had gone, and let stillness do its good work. When the letter came inviting her to speak in a hall lit by chandeliers, she sent a reply that said, respectfully, that her work was here, that the best speech she could give was a machine leaving a bay without a ghost in its gears. They wrote back with understanding phrased like grace. A box arrived later with a medal mounted on velvet and a note in a precise hand, for service continued. She put it in the office on the shelf above the ledger and the binder, where it could watch the calendar fill and empty and fill again. On a Sunday, the council renamed the short stretch of road behind the shop where the freight spur used to feed the mill. Not Main. Nothing dramatic. Just a lane that made deliveries easier. The new sign went up on a simple post, Walker Line. Kids asked if it was for the lady at the shop. Parents said yes, and then said the thing that matters in small towns, because she stayed. The seasons did their reliable miracle. Summer heat made the concrete sweat. Fall trimmed the light earlier each week. Winter put a white edge on the roofline and taught new students what metal feels like when the air steals warmth from your hands. Spring pushed green into the ditch along the apron and reminded everyone that growth is mostly boring until one morning it isn't. Through it all, the bays rang with work. Not dramatic work. Necessary work. The kind that travels, invisible and faithful, into places where things break at the worst possible time and don't, because someone in a town most maps ignore once listened long enough to hear a problem before it announced itself. On a late afternoon that felt like a page turn, Kate closed the last ticket of the day and wiped her hands on a rag that had more stories than most books. She stepped outside. The light fell clean along Main, catching dust motes like tiny planets. Across the street the diner bell gave a lazy ring. Down the block, a dog barked once and thought better of it. She listened for the train and heard it, low, steady, like breath, coming from a distance that didn't hurt anymore. Ryan joined her, leaned against the jamb, said nothing. Logan clicked the deadbolt on the side door and looked up at the sky like it might contain a schematic. Emily turned the open sign to closed with a satisfaction that comes from doing enough but not too much. George shut the office light and stood in the doorway a second longer than habit, an old man measuring the day and finding it exactly the right length. Kate thought about the first sound that turned the town toward this path, the way a single wrong note can carry a whole life into a different key. She thought about the years she tried to live small, like a machine limited by a governor someone else set. She thought about the moment the governor came off and the engine didn't redline, it found its proper range. Not louder. Truer. She didn't make a speech, not even in her head. She just let the lesson settle where lessons belong, in hands, in eyes, in the next right action. Machines don't care about perfect. They care about honest. People, too. You listen, you correct, you torque to spec, you check again, and then you send it out into the world with the confidence that comes from work done right when no one was watching. Behind her, Bay 3 breathed the quiet of a good shop at rest. In front of her, the road took the evening light and offered it to every mile that needed it. The engines would come tomorrow, the students, the small emergencies, the ordinary miracles. Clearwater would keep its promise. And when the hard days returned, as they always do, the work would hold, because it had been built under heat and pressure, and the people who built it had learned how to carry weight without breaking. She reached up, flipped the switch, and watched the shop lights fall away one by one until only the apron glow remained. The sign under the sign caught the last of the sun and gave it back without asking for credit. Kate locked the door, felt the click seat home, and walked toward the kind of evening you earn.